I don't know about you, but I think some of us may be experiencing a little bit of this thing called Zoom fatigue. Some of you have enjoyed all parts of the pandemic where attending things in your pajamas has been just, well, divine. But for others, we miss and crave being in community, feeling a sense of connectivity and feeling each other's presence. A presence which can really only come about when you're in a room with somebody, sharing food with them, or in the case of the Parsha for this week, that we are experiencing as it describes God living amongst them. And yet, we live in a time period where, well, with the technology being what it is, I don't know if that's going to ever change. In many regards, as Jonathan Sarna pointed out in a lecture earlier this week, which he offered, this period that we are in is a major inflection point, the equivalent of which would be the printing press, where for the first time humanity really was able to experience words beyond the limitations earlier given by scribes, meaning very limited number of copies. All of the sudden, literacy became this huge tool that we were able to communicate and engage with one another. Ideas were able to be shared quickly across broad geographic distances that didn't have that opportunity. And technology in the digital age has only been accelerated by COVID. And so the idea that we would be solely and only ever in synagogues where we would once again experience God dwelling not just inside of but among us, forces us to challenge and become challenged to create not just a model that's relevant for life in one aspect of who we are as a community, the idea that we are intimately connected, but how can we functionally go forward in the digital age, a digital age which we can see little snippets occurring within changes, even within Facebook. Albeit Facebook didn't have the best week. I think Mark Zuckerberg was reported to lose personally $3 billion in wealth. Regardless, what we were seeing was that Facebook saw a total saturation of the market for the first time. The idea, and we see what they're doing in response, is by relabeling themselves the metaverse and putting a lot of R&D into augmented reality and virtual reality. We also see that that's not taking place only there, but I don't know about you, but I saw all sorts of trends online where people were wearing the goggles and doing crazy, silly things in their living room after the holiday season, when it looked like if you were wearing one of those goggles, you were going to go flying off a mountain, and in fact, you fell into a sofa. As funny as that may have been to observe on those little clips of people doing, well, funny moments, the truth is that probably if we were to anticipate what phones are going to look like, it's not going to look like a handheld device anymore. Rather, it's probably going to be something wearable. Reality is going to be augmented by technology as we go forward, and we will no longer necessarily only be able to experience life as it was, where phones tied us to a wall at one point with a cord, but as we all know, we are no longer tethered to a cord. Off we go, which is in some ways fabulous because it means an ability to work remotely and be anywhere at any time. And yet at the other time, we see that perhaps one of the biggest reasons why we are experiencing the Great Resignation is that we are no longer tied with boundaries of work time, home time, play time, but all the time there's accessibility for work, forcing us all to have stronger boundaries around that. So the issue as portrayed in the Bible for the Parsha for this week, where God is going to dwell amongst us in a sanctuary, I'll remind you, is yet one more moment of major inflection. For how did Abraham interact with God? Well, Abraham interacted with God by going out in the wilderness and interacting with God. Abraham heard God's calling. And in fact, that's in a way how our forefathers, Isaac, Jacob, and even Joseph and Moses interacted with God. Moses saw a burning bush and there was God and experienced God one-on-one directly. And yet for us, there was a shift in our relationship with God. It was no longer a one-on-one interaction. Rather, God was going to dwell amongst the people in a sanctuary, around the ark, and people were going to engage in God in the tent of meetings. A major shift, an inflection point, if you will. Not, I would say, unlike what we are experiencing today. So I think, of course, it's anxiety provoking. All change is. Where are we going? What are we doing? Are we still going to be able to connect? How can we connect? And yet when we think about it, well, it's going to be probably very similar to what we experience. There will always be in-person stuff. Things will always be happening together. Of course, that's valuable. I love being in the sanctuary, especially in Macon, where I look up and I know it's not the eye of God. It was a Masonic architect that helped design the sanctuary, and yet in my own head, it's always that eye looking down from the dome over us. And I have the verse, Dalifnei Ata Omed, in my head every time I see that eyeball, know before whom you stand, imbibing inside of me the feeling that I need to be aware of my reality, where I'm at, and in my relationship with God that only exists in the sanctuary. And there's a very specific feeling that occurs by praying together in the sanctuary. And yet we also are aware that we have members of the community for whom sanctuary, it's not the same thing. It's not sitting in the sanctuary, and for them, Zoom is their reality, and that's how they want to participate going forward. And they don't have that Zoom fatigue that some of us experience. And having a model where we have hybrid going forward, an inflection point, but I'm pretty much thinking it's an exciting inflection point. Just like it was for Moses and Aaron and Miriam and the entire Jewish people building a sanctuary, creating a tent of meetings, and having God live amongst the people, we too will have God live amongst us. God will live amongst us both in the Zoom room, on social media, and amongst us in person. And while all of this change and shift is scary, it is overwhelming at times, and there are congregants for whom Zoom is not their comfort level, and Facebook, they just never really got into, or Metaverse just wasn't their thing. Still fascinating that for others it is. And so while we are in our own Gutenberg inflection point and major shift, I invite all of us to recognize that even in biblical times, how we engaged in worship, how we related to God, morphed and changed over time, just as it will today, morph and change. May this morphing and changing help deepen our relationship with one another and help deepen our relationship with the divine. Ken Yehi Ratzon, may this be God's will.